I will begin this Sunday morning with some simple questions. What happened with the Marxist feminism movement in France? With the recent conservative debates about women, family, religion we saw, we can ask, does it exist a Marxist feminism tradition in France? And if it exists, what did it concretely do in the French society? And why didn't it appear these last years? So, to try to answer these questions, I would like to present today a little bit of the history of the Marxist feminism in France across a concrete example forgotten by the historiography, which is the example of the French General Confederation of Labour, CGT in French, that will be called Confédération during the conference. This confederation is quantitatively and historically the first union in France, created in 1895 and is based on Marxist foundations. This example is really interesting because it helps us to question the formation of the memory we have nowadays in the continental capitalist Europe, 30 years after the collapse of the real socialism, of what the Marxist organizations concretely realized for women's emancipation during the 20th century. In fact, the new generations can't think about the relationships between Marxism and feminism nowadays without considering the historical defeat of the working class and the remarkable victory we hope a provisory run of capitalism toward the barbarization of social life. This provisory victory has consequences on many levels of worker lives, and also on the way to interpret the proper Marxist organization past. To say a little more about this defeat of the working class, I would like to remember that in France, the government voted 3 months ago the reform of the labor code, which destroys a great part of the labor and social protections. In spite of all the strikes, manifestations, mainly organized by the Confederation, and exercising an ideological repression against militants, French media had represented the militants as animals, which was a common representation until the end of the 19th century, when unions were illegal. The Prime Minister, as the Labor Minister, also made statements with a view to criminalize them. Above all, the aim of these attacks was to discredit the type of union the Confederation incarnates until today and to deny a part of our social history. Because historically, the Confederation refuses the common definition of union just as co-management between employers and employees, but brings a socialist project, that is to say, an alternative project of society without capitalist exploration. Besides, the Confederation had an essential role in the rights accumulation in France, particularly thanks to its fundamental role in the resistance organization during the fascist occupation and in the reconstruction of the French society after that period with the welfare state project. So the debate between feminism and Marxism takes place in France in this concrete social situation. Now, I want to present the point of view of the French feminist classical historiography gives of the role of the French Marxist Confederation in the women's rights concrete victories. An analysis of the works published about the relationships between the Confederation and feminism reveals that there are 23 articles written between 1956 and 1998 about Marxist feminism in the French unions, and only 7 academic articles are about the Confederation. That is to say that feminist Marxism has an underestimated presence. Besides, when we study these 7 works, we can identify that they present a unitarian and coherent vision of the Confederation. Firstly, militant men are uniform. They promote the same representation of masculine virtues. Secondly, and consequently, they are insensitive to the specific problems of women, what have consequences in their activism. In the one side, the refusal of seeing the specificity of the women's exploration, and in the other side, a uniform vision of what is the working class. Thirdly, men are competing with women because of the two reasons presented before. In addition, and consequently, the French feminist movement appears several times in the official historiography, that is to say, also in the historiography learned at school, presented in the media sphere, as if it had started at the end of the 60s, thanks especially to the feminist theories developed in the university during that period. But some French militants and historians already question this vision. They show that the Socialist Confederation is historically the first massive space that had a concern about feminist questions before the so-called feminist movement appears. And they show that the victories of the 70s, as the voluntary interruption of pregnancy, the free access to contraception, etc., are a result of a constant struggle organized by the women of the Confederation before the existence of the autonomous feminist movement. I made a little list of some elements the Confederation did to help women's rights between the beginning of the 20th century and the 70s, moment of the creation of the feminist movement in France. Since the beginning of the 20th century, in the Confederation founding text, the militants took care of mentioning that their struggle involved men and women workers. The topic of women workers appeared 4 times during the Confederation Congresses between 1888 and 1898. In some economic areas, such as tobacco and clothing, women represented more than 50% of the militants in the beginning of the 20th century. Between 1910 and 1914, the Confederation organized several campaigns to sensitize women workers on the importance of the class struggle. During the 30s and 40s, the professional training financed by state and completed by the employer was a constant claim, because a woman with a professional diploma couldn't be paid less than a man, which was a capitalist strategy. In 1946, occurred the first conference about women in work, named Women's Work, to understand better the specificities of their positions in capitalism. In 1955, the Confederation created the first French review for women workers, named Antoinette. In 1973, the claim for the free voluntary interruption of pregnancy and contraception appeared thanks to the campaign named To Have the Children We Desire, 2 years before the women's liberation movement claimed it. The same year, the National Congress reaffirmed the specificity of the women's exploration at work and in the family sphere. And thanks to an internal policy, in 1978, the Confederation was the union with the biggest number of women at positions of responsibility, 27%. I also want to develop here an example I think fantastic that doesn't appear in the French feminist historiography. In the beginning of the 50s, the metal workers' polyclinic, created in Paris in 1938 by the Metal Workers' Federation and completely managed and financed by militants, opened a center. Its objective was to introduce, for the first time in France, the painless childbirth. The doctor, Fernand Lamaze, formed in the Soviet Union, where he discovered the existence of this technique, proposed to experience it at the polyclinic, and the project was immediately accepted. We were in 1951. That is to say that the Confederation financed the first French project about painless childbirth. The painless childbirth treatment was based on the idea that childbirth, as synonymous of painful act, was not a necessity for women. On the contrary, the Bible said it. The aim was to stop with the practice of a pregnancy as an alienation phenomenon, and also with the prejudice that for being woman, a mother naturally knew what to do with the baby. Techniques of respiration, which are nowadays famous, sexual education for women, but also their husbands, were part of the program. That is to say, poor workers had access to a knowledge before reserved for the elite. The doctor practiced this method in more than 40,000 metal worker wives, women working as metal workers, such as women belonging to the Confederation, for free until his death in 1957. So the Confederation did a lot for women. I will do a short conclusion. How it is possible to not speak about this example in our feminist official history? To try to rebuild a Marxist-Feminist movement after the collapse of the working class and the victory of capitalism. It is necessary to take account of its effects, that is to say, the effects of that collapse in the theoretical formulations, that is to say, the social science formulation of what is society. Class struggle concept and experiences are, most of the time, excluded. Only an analysis of the society shown as a totality can help us to produce a relevant Marxist autocritic able to see and understand the contradictions and the limits of the socialist experiences of the 20th century concerning women and concerning also other questions, but without excluding or denying our own social history. Thank you.